The 80s, what a time to be alive. Even if you were a child of the 90s or the aughts, the wave of nostalgia from the decade of decadence has come back in full force with releases like Stranger Things, It Chapters 1 and 2, remakes of classic films, and even music with The Weeknd diving heavy into synth pop. With the death of disco in 1979 and a demand for change, the 1980s evolved into a neon-soaked, totally rad decade held firmly together with cans of Aqua Net, burning a hole in the ozone. While other decades can certainly be recognized for their timelessness, there's just something about the 80s that reminds all of us of a better time, more than the others.
I'd buy that for $1.
But it was also a time when rebellion in the media would kickstart into the heart of the system with the impending US political race between 1950s actor Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter.
Ronald Reagan, the actor?
It was also a time when the height of the Cold War would shape the entirety of the decade.
The 80s was a crazy time. You know, the Reagan sort of running rampant, the Cold War was still on.
As a gradual response to the change, heavy metal would make its transition from the classic rock and roll sound of the 70s to come into its own with Judas Priest, Motorhead, Ozzy's solo debut, AC/DC's Back in Black, and metal in the US would soon follow. The time for free love and hope for peace was over. It was a time for a revolution. But with filmmakers, their creative dreams would lead to explore more areas which haven't been touched on before.
We had a lot of fun. I think a lot of good movies were made during that time.
The 80s horror films in general, I think, brought us a chance to face our fears in a safe environment.
It expanded, at least in my mind, what horror movies, and I use that term in like the way that horror movies, what horror movies could actually do as an art form.
It was the year horror would be forever changed. This is 1980, a new beginning in our 80s horror memories. Horror films have been around since the dawn of motion pictures, with 1896's House of the Devil, and have evolved greatly with each passing decade. But as the genre continued to come into its own, so have the creators, continuing to push the envelope more and more as time went on. When the 70s rolled around, filmmakers became creative with masterpieces such as The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Black Christmas, and of course, Halloween. These three films in general laid the foundation of horror yet to come. Not only did audiences want more, but so did producers. Seeing the numbers brought in from these thrill rides of cinema on such a small budget, it was a no-brainer to see what else they could come up with.
You know, when we did Corman films, the formula was that every time they looked up from the back seat in the drive-in, you know, you had to have a scare, you had to do something so the girl would jump back in the guy's arms. Valid, but better if you've got more stuff going on. And I think that that's why the 80s horror films still hold up, because a lot of those guys really had cool stuff they were saying.
This episode, we will be focusing on not just one horror film in particular, but a few notable ones that are worth a revisit if you haven't seen them in a while, or at all. While the fun horror films of the 80s as we know them today were just beginning to come into their own, one carried on the grisly midnight feel similar to Wes Craven's Last House on the Left and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from the previous decade.
Maniac. It will tear the life out of you.
With a limited release beginning that January, Maniac stars Joe Spinell as Frank Zito, our titular character who murders and scalps his young women victims, placing the freshly severed mops onto the top of mannequins. Pretty simple plot, right? And to our young viewers, Something so simple and gory comes as nothing new thanks to the torture porn era of the mid-2000s, and most recently even Art the Clown in the mega slasher Terrifier.
I think there are a lot more risks on one hand taken, a lot more acceptance of some of the craziness that goes on in those movies.
But at the time, films like Maniac were a shock to audiences, with its realistic and brutal gore, thanks to special effects maestro Tom Savini, an important name that you'll hear more than a dozen times throughout this series, most notably from the original Friday the 13th. It's a raw and grisly film, and while it could just be downgraded to exploitation just for the hell of it,
oh, I grew up absolutely loving exploitation movies.
It's a guerrilla style and avant-garde take on the seedy and sleaziness of New York City when crime was rampant.
What people today can't imagine, I mean, they really can't imagine like it was then, was what it was like to see a good exploitation movie in a packed Times Square movie house.
Things like Maniac, like they are exploring real world nightmares, killers, rapists, the worst that humanity has to offer, and trying to make a buck off of it.
It's definitely not the New York we know today. Although Frank Zito is the main character of the film, one can't really root for him. But Spinell's performance is one to empathize with. The MPAA, now simply the MPA, have always come down hard on horror when it comes to intense violence, but not for dropping an F-bomb or showing boobs in the first couple of minutes in 16 Candles.
I can't believe this. They fucking forgot my birthday.
You know, for some reason. While today's standards may have softened a bit, Maniac had to undergo multiple cuts just to establish an R rating for a wider release. While the film did well at the box office based on its minimal budget, Maniac was criticized heavily for its depiction of realistic violence towards women. Most notably, celebrity critics Siskel and Ebert, the thumbs up or thumbs down guys, sided with the negatives, with Gene Siskel naming it one of the dogs of the week, and Roger Ebert not even making it 20 minutes into the film. It's not a film for everyone, but if you give it a try, you will subject yourself to a grimy character study that moves like lightning.
The ones we remember are the ones that are actually exploring why these people are killing, the impact that those kills have on them, which is why Maniac is always sort of interesting.
Since the 80s, the film has reached a cult status, praising the performance of Spinell and for the film's character study status, not unlike another disturbing film with a titular character as the lead in Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. Its true audience wouldn't find its home until later, with the home video release.
Dressed to Kill. Michael Caine, Angie Dickinson, Nancy Allen. Dressed to Kill. Murder, Made to Order by Brian De Palma.
While the 80s saw De Palma as a true master in his craft in different genres, his first film of the decade continued his dive into neo-noir thrillers. Released in the summer of 1980, Dressed to Kill follows Kate Miller, a sexually frustrated housewife in New York City. After leaving her psychiatrist, played by Michael Caine, she meets a mysterious man in a museum. Intrigued, she follows him out of the building, and the two eventually head back to his swanky New York apartment where he quickly fulfills her desires. Upon sneaking out of the apartment, she is immediately killed by a blonde woman in disguise. But that's the only spoiler I'll give you, because the less that's known about this movie, the better. A prostitute named Liz Blake witnesses this murder, which makes her a #1 target by the unknown killer. After being rescued by Kate's son Peter, the pair team up to track down the true identity of his mother's killer. The early works of De Palma show a director who is greatly inspired by Jean-Luc Godard and Alfred Hitchcock. To call him the Hitchcock of his time would be an understatement. And with Dressed to Kill, he wears that badge of honor on his sleeve. From cinematography choices down to the ending, his films contain many references to Psycho.
Had the idea, like Psycho, to have the movie star get bumped off, 20, 30 minutes into the movie.
It did moderately well when it was released, but gets criminally overlooked compared to his other films like Blowout or Scarface. The identity of the killer is a total surprise, and while I wonder how this film would play in today's age, Dressed to Kill is a pure cinematic masterpiece from a director in his prime.
One believed it. Now, no one will forget it. Alligator.
What happens when you flush a live baby alligator down the toilet? In this case, it lives in the sewers, surviving off the remains of discarded laboratory animals injected with growth hormones. Alligator tells the story of a young girl purchasing a baby gator while at a tourist trap in Florida. Upon returning, her overbearing father proceeds to flush it down to the sewers. 12 years later, it has grown into an over 30-foot-long killing machine. And now it's up to an officer and reptile expert to stop the beast from killing its residents of Chicago. Yes, a title like this could without a doubt be unremarkable and forgettable, but it's a film that knows exactly what it is, which works in its favor. In the 70s, many films attempted to capitalize on the success of Jaws, and failing for the most part.
There were great exploitation movies made during the 70s. Grizzly's a sensational monster movie.
Alligator was released late in 1980. It could have easily joined the ranks of another run-of-the-mill mockbuster. Yet, with its clever story penned by Piranha scribe John Sayles, the film earned praise from critics and fans alike. It took the urban legend of rogue alligators and other animals running wild in the sewers of New York and cleverly delivered a horror film with sharp wit and humanized characters. Even by today's standards, the practical effects horror films of the 80s are known for holding up tremendously well, most notably the film's climax where the monstrous gator attacks a wedding party. However, unlike Jaws or many other critically praised horror films of the decade, Alligator didn't have to rely on sequels to keep its legacy alive. It took 11 years for its only sequel to come into fruition, but it also lacks the cleverness of the original.
Neighborhood video stores, typical of the ones that are cropping up all over the country. And in 3 minutes, you and I are going to get an education.
Horror during this time period was produced so rapidly that most gems were underseen during their initial run. This is where mom and pop video stores and big chain stores would give these films another life. Even gas stations jumped in on the home video market boom. In the case of horror, most producers caught on early and capitalized on the revenue brought in from sales and rentals by releasing them straight to video. Notable legendary producers such as Roger Corman and Charles Band shined in the direct-to-video market, but it wouldn't be for another few years to really catch on for Mr. Band.
If nothing else, we had heart, and I think a bunch of people had talent.
While you can now sit in the comfort of your own home and scroll for hours trying to find the right movie to watch for the night, nothing compared to going to the video store on a Friday night to see if your favorite movie was in or not.
When you're walking down the video store aisle and you're looking at titles and you realize there's someone next to you, you're like, what do you think? Or they say, you seen this? Suddenly you find a compatriot in the horror movie journey in those video aisles. I think that we're missing today is that sense of community beyond just what we find on the internet, but just sharing titles with people in a video store and then seeing them later and building that sense of connectivity. I hope that we get back to some way where physical media is something that we share and not just something that we email.
And if it wasn't in, there were plenty of other options to choose from. Don't have the fog? Check out Humanoids from the Deep, Motel Hell, Mother's Day, New Year's Evil, Christmas Evil, or even Cannibal Holocaust. Just hide that one from your parents, of course. Topping it off with a couple pizzas from Domino's, Pizza Hut, or whatever your favorite pizza joint was at the time made the evening absolute perfection. Hell, if it weren't for VHS or cable TV for that matter, I wouldn't have been subjected to the films that made me the gorehound I am today. Once upon a time, when kids went outside to play and ride on bikes exactly how you would see it in some Amblin film, I biked my way to a local mom and pop shop who didn't give a damn who they rented their titles to, even if it was an R-rated movie, to a 10-year-old. I know. Tell us more about the war, Grandpa.
How do you do, fellow kids?
But holding forbidden titles like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Faces of Death in your hands at that age, knowing damn well you shouldn't, was a special feeling. And gathering your best buds and throwing these titles on during a sleepover, or a spend the night party, as we called them, while your parents were asleep, was just icing on the cake. 80s horror remains as one of the most fun and inventive narratives to this day, with its pushing of the envelope on what it could be or its use of practical effects. And while they may come off as cheesy or cheap looking, you can't deny the cultural impact that it has on pop culture today. 1980 may not have truly reached its potential in terms of horror, but it laid the groundwork of what it would become. It was a dawn of a new era. A new beginning. What are some of your memories from this time? No matter what generation you're from, boomers to Gen Z, we would love to hear your thoughts on what brought you to horror. Leave us a comment down below. We'd love to talk to you. Until then, my fellow gorehounds, stay tubular.
On the next episode, pack your bags because JoBlo and Arrow in the Head are taking you to camp. Enjoy the lovely cabins, breathtaking scenery, and indulge in recreational sex, drugs, and partying. Most of all, try to survive the night in the mother of all slasher films. You're all doomed.
Oh, shut up, Ralph.
Hi friends, your humble narrator Tyler Nichols here, and I hope that you enjoyed that episode of 80s Horror Memories. If you missed our previous episode, click over here. If you want to see more from our series, click up here. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you doing? Subscribe right here. And most importantly, stay spooky, folks.